David Nichols had spent the last 7 years building what he thought was a life to cherish with Sarah. Their relationship, founded on love, trust, and shared goals, was meant to stand the test of time, but it wasn't the years together or the memories they had made that held any lasting meaning. It was the inheritance, over $10 million, that Sarah received. After her parents tragically passed away in a car accident, David remembered meeting Sarah back in college, their worlds seemingly different. He had come from a humble background, a scholarship student, working part-time to pay his tuition. Sarah, on the other hand, was from old money. Her family's wealth had been built on generations of success. But somehow, despite their differences, they found a bond. She liked that he was grounded, someone who didn't take things for granted. While she lived in a curated world of country clubs and charity luncheons, they married in a beautiful ceremony that felt like the beginning of everything. David poured his heart into their life together, focusing on building their dream home and their business. Every detail of their modern townhouse was crafted with his own hands. He had literally built it from the ground up. They also had a successful interior design firm. Sarah handled the client relations, while David took care of the design and the crafting side of things. Everything seemed perfect. They were partners in every sense, or so David believed. Then came the news of Sarah's parents' deaths. It had been a shock, one that rattled them both. Sarah was devastated, as anyone would be after losing both parents in such a short amount of time. David supported her through the funerals and the grief, never letting her go through it alone. He held her through the sleepless nights, making promises that they would get through this together. But in the weeks that followed, everything began to change. Sarah received her inheritance, and with it came a shift in her demeanor. At first, David chalked it up to the stress of the situation, but he soon realized that something was off. Sarah became distant, cold even. What used to be a warm, loving partnership turned into something he couldn't recognize. One fateful morning, as David returned home early from a jog, he discovered Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, her face expressionless. Without warning, she handed him a set of divorce papers. "Sign it," she said flatly. There was no emotion in her voice, nothing but an emptiness that sent a chill down David's spine. He was caught off guard. He had assumed that after everything they had been through together, this marriage would last. But now, standing in front of him, was a woman who had become a stranger, a woman who seemed determined to end their life together without a second thought. David asked, "Why? What's happening, Sarah?" She didn't even look him in the eyes. "I just need you gone," she said. His mind raced as he processed what was happening. He had just spent years of his life building a future with Sarah, and now everything they had was slipping away in the blink of an eye. There was no fight, no pleading. She had already made up her mind. The love they had once shared, the dreams they had built together, meant nothing now. David stood still for a moment, struggling to keep his composure. He had always believed in their love, but now, faced with these divorce papers, everything had changed. It wasn't just a divorce, it was a complete and total betrayal. He had loved Sarah, had built a life with her, and yet here she was, pushing him out of the life they had created without hesitation. As he packed his things, Sarah's brothers arrived. They were bigger than David, both physically imposing, and they had no intention of letting him leave peacefully. When David refused to hand over his bag, they grabbed him by the arms, one pulling him by the hair, dragging him across the marble floor he had spent so many hours working on. It was painful, humiliating, but David refused to let them see the anger boiling inside him. At the door, as they were forcing him out, David turned to Sarah, who was watching from the threshold with a cold smirk on her face. He looked her in the eye and said, "You'll regret this, all of you." She didn't respond. She simply smirked, the look of someone who was convinced they had already won. But David knew better. This wasn't the end for him. It was just the beginning of something else, something he had been building without her knowledge. David drove away from the house, the weight of the divorce papers heavy in his lap. His fingers brushed over the crisp paper, the reality of it sinking in slowly. He hadn't expected this. He knew Sarah had changed over the last few months, but he never thought it would come to this, being thrown out of the house they built together. No warning, no discussion, just the cold finality of those papers. As he drove through the streets of Bennett, Colorado, The familiar sights did nothing to ease his mind. The houses, the trees, the small town feel that once seemed like the perfect place to build a life, now felt foreign. He had always felt grounded here, but today everything felt different. He wasn't just losing Sarah, he was losing his identity, his sense of security. Everything they had worked for was slipping away, just like that. David pulled up to the small rented flat on the edge of town. It wasn't much a stark contrast to the sprawling home he had left behind, but it would do. The flat was quiet, secluded, just him and his thoughts. The moment he stepped inside, he shut the door behind him, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt alone. But it wasn't a feeling of loneliness, it was a feeling of clarity. He had been living under a cloud of deception for too long, and now, with the space to think, he knew what he had to do. He went straight to his laptop. Over the past week, he had started compiling evidence, little by little. Emails, phone records, messages. He had all the proof he needed, proof that Sarah had betrayed him. She thought she had control over everything, that her inheritance would be enough to secure her future without him. But David had learned to play the long game, and now, with everything he had gathered, it was time to make his move. The first thing he did was contact Anton, an old friend who worked as a tech forensic analyst. Anton owed him from a job they had worked on together years ago, and now it was time to cash in that favor. Anton didn't ask questions, he simply agreed to help. Together, they cloned Sarah's devices, everything from her phone to her laptop, and what they found was beyond anything David had anticipated. Sarah had forged his signature on several business documents, misreported earnings, and even hidden assets. It wasn't just infidelity, it was financial fraud. And the man behind it all, her lawyer, a man named Chris Ruston, who had helped her cover her tracks. David sat there, staring at the evidence in front of him, his hands trembling with a mixture of disbelief and anger. He had always trusted her, and now, she had destroyed that trust in the most calculated way possible. David knew he couldn't let this go unnoticed. He couldn't just walk away and let Sarah win. He had to fight, but he wasn't going to fight dirty. He was going to fight smart. The first step was to create chaos. He sent the evidence of Sarah's financial discrepancies to the IRS, using an anonymous whistleblower account, the forged signatures, the misreported earnings, everything. Then he sent copies to her father's former business partner, who had a solid case to sue her. If Sarah thought she was going to keep the inheritance without consequences, she was sorely mistaken. But David didn't stop there. He had a reputation to protect. He had built everything they had together, and now it was time to take that away from her. The design firm they had created, the business that he had poured so much of himself into, was no longer going to be hers. David presented the evidence of Sarah's wrongdoing to the board of directors, showing them that she had locked him out of the business while still using his intellectual property. The firm was quietly dissolved, its name tarnished beyond repair. And to top it all off, David sold the blueprints for their dream house to a competitor for a seven-figure sum. He had taken everything from her, piece by piece, and he wasn't done yet. But the most important piece of the puzzle had yet to fall into place. David had learned everything he needed to know about Sarah's betrayal, and now it was time to confront her. He arranged to meet her at a restaurant they had frequented in better days. It was the perfect setting, quiet, private, and familiar. Sarah walked in, looking flustered in black, mourning the death of her reputation. But David remained calm, steady, and sure of his next move. He didn't wait long before sliding a folder across the table to her. Inside was the evidence of her downfall, her father's former partner's lawsuit, her misdeeds exposed for all to see. Sarah's eyes widened, her face drained of color, but David wasn't finished. He leaned forward, locking eyes with her, and said simply, "You took the house, but I took your foundation." David stood up, leaving Sarah behind in her shock and disbelief. He walked out into the night air, feeling the rain slick the streets beneath him. There was no triumph, no celebration, just the satisfaction of knowing that he had taken control back. He had built everything she had, and now, it was his turn to tear it all down. David sat quietly in the rented flat, the sound of rain pattering against the window as the night wore on. His mind wasn't at rest, but there was a certain calmness to the storm brewing inside him. Everything he had done up to this point, from gathering evidence to methodically dismantling Sarah's life, had been with one thing in mind: to ensure she understood the weight of her actions. The house, the business, the reputation, they were just the surface. What Sarah hadn't counted on was the fact that David wasn't just fighting for what was his. He was fighting for something deeper: his dignity, his pride, and the belief that no one should get away with this kind of betrayal without facing the consequences. It had been weeks since their confrontation at the restaurant. The last time he saw her face, pale and shattered, had been in that moment when he told her, "You took the house, but I took your foundation." Now, the pieces were falling into place. David hadn't heard from Sarah since that night. She was no longer the powerful figure she had once been. Her inheritance, once her trump card, was now a liability, as he had so carefully ensured. The lawsuit from her father's former partner was already in motion, and the IRS investigation into her fraudulent activities had begun. She thought she could bury the past, but David had exposed it to the light, and the fallout had begun. But there was more to do. The final blow was still ahead. David knew that Sarah had tried to push him out of her life, but she hadn't succeeded. Not really. He had no intention of playing her game or giving her the satisfaction of watching him fall apart. Instead, he had built something new, something that didn't rely on her family's money, or on their tainted legacy. His new venture, Reeves Ethical Capital, was thriving. It was a business founded on transparency, accountability, and trust, three things that had been sorely lacking in his marriage to Sarah. He had gathered a team of like-minded individuals, people who believed in building something solid, something with integrity. It wasn't the fast-track success of flashy startups, but it was real, and it was growing, and that was something Sarah couldn't take from him. David had made a name for himself in the business world, but now, as his new company continued to gain traction, it was time to take his revenge to the next level. He wanted to see Sarah and her accomplices crumble, and he knew just how to do it. The plan was simple. He would make sure everyone knew what Sarah had done. She wouldn't just lose her money, she would lose everything that mattered to her. David had arranged another meeting, this time with her lawyer, Chris, the man who had helped Sarah cover up her tracks and had been complicit in every part of the plan. The meeting would be a simple one. David had no intention of negotiating with Chris. He had something far more powerful in mind. The day arrived. David dressed in a sharp suit, his appearance immaculate, every detail of his plan carefully thought out. He wasn't here to be vindictive or petty. He was here to take down the system they had built, to expose the lies and deceit that had been buried beneath layers of wealth and privilege. When David arrived at the office, Chris was waiting for him. His smug expression faltered the moment their eyes met. Chris knew why he was here. The moment David sat down across from him, the tension in the room was palpable. Chris started speaking, trying to ease into the conversation with formalities, but David cut him off. "I'm not here for pleasantries," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here to make sure you understand what's coming. I have everything you and Sarah have been hiding. The evidence, the proof, it's all there." Chris's face tightened, and he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. But David wasn't done. He slid a folder across the table, the same one he had prepared weeks ago, containing everything he had gathered. Emails, call logs, bank statements, all of it. Chris glanced at the folder, and then back at David. "This isn't how it has to go down," he said, trying to regain his composure. "We can still settle this quietly." David shook his head. "No, it's too late for quiet settlements. Your involvement in all of this makes you just as guilty. This ends now, Chris." The next few days were a whirlwind. David used the evidence he had collected to make sure Sarah's world would come crashing down around her. He contacted the media, ensuring they were aware of the lawsuit and the fraud. He reached out to other business partners, those who had been in the dark about Sarah's actions, and informed them of the illegal dealings she had engaged in. And then he made sure Sarah's reputation was tarnished beyond repair. The affair, the lies, the fraud, it all came out. Sarah could no longer hide behind her inheritance or her carefully constructed life. David didn't stop there. He contacted her family, making sure they knew the truth about their daughter, the ones who had blindly supported her, the ones who had always seen her as the golden child. Now, they would see her for who she truly was. And as David sat back, watching everything fall apart, he didn't feel a rush of triumph or satisfaction. What he felt was a quiet sense of peace. He had taken everything she held dear, and in doing so, he had reclaimed his own life, his dignity, his power. For the first time in years, David felt free. As the days passed, David's life began to settle into a routine, albeit one that was colder, quieter, and more controlled. He was no longer the man who had built a life with Sarah. The full weight of their once harmonious marriage had crumbled, leaving only the foundations of truth beneath. And the truth was something Sarah would never be able to escape, no matter how hard she tried. David spent most of his time in the rented flat, working on his new venture, Reeves Ethical Capital. It wasn't just a business to him, it was his way of rebuilding everything he had lost. He had poured his heart into this company, creating a platform based on transparency, ethics, and accountability, things Sarah had never understood. But as the weeks wore on, David felt the weight of his choices, of what he had sacrificed. He hadn't just lost a wife, he had lost a version of himself he could never get back. The man who had trusted, who had loved, who had believed in the future they would share. It wasn't the house he missed, nor the money, but the sense of belonging. The dream they had built together, now shattered into pieces. But every piece of that dream had been laced with lies and betrayal. And now, David was watching everything come full circle. Sarah's downfall was inevitable. The evidence he had sent to the IRS had set things in motion. Her fraudulent activities were no longer hidden. The media had picked up the story, and within days, her name was being dragged through the mud. But that wasn't enough for David. He wanted to see her lose everything, not just the money, but the reputation she had spent years curating. David had waited for this moment, the final blow. He had prepared for it meticulously. The last piece of the puzzle was in place. He had no more ties to her, no more connection to the life they had once shared. Sarah had underestimated him, thinking that by taking the house and the wealth, she could erase him from her life. But David wasn't just a victim, he was a force to be reckoned with, and he was about to prove it. It all came to a head when David was contacted by her lawyer, Chris Hurston, the same man who had been involved in covering up Sarah's illegal activities. The meeting was set for the following week. David had all the evidence he needed to bring Sarah to her knees. But this time, it wasn't just about the money. It was about something deeper, something more personal. This was about power, control, and the ability to shape the future. The meeting took place in a dimly lit office on the top floor of a sleek downtown building. The tension in the air was palpable as David walked into the room. Chris was already there, sitting behind a polished mahogany desk, his eyes cold and calculating. He didn't even look up as David entered. David stood tall, his voice steady as he spoke. "I know what you've done, and I'm not going to let you get away with it. You thought you could control everything, but you were wrong. Now, everything is in my hands." Chris finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. He tried to maintain his composure, but David could see the fear creeping into his expression. "You don't know what you're messing with," Chris said, his voice low. David smirked, leaning in closer. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm messing with, and now, you're going to pay the price, all of you." He slid a folder across the desk, one that contained everything. The illegal transactions, the forged signatures, the evidence of the affair, and most importantly, the lies. It was all there in black and white. Chris's face turned pale as he flipped through the documents. He knew it was over. He had no way out. David wasn't interested in making deals or negotiating with him. You can take your money, your power, your connections, and your lawyer tricks, but none of that matters now. You've already lost. David stood up, his posture unwavering. "Sarah thought she could take everything from me, but in the end, I took what mattered most, her foundation, her reputation, and now I'm taking what's left." With that, David walked out of the office, leaving Chris to face the consequences of his actions. As he stepped into the elevator, a sense of finality washed over him. This was it, the last chapter of his journey, and it was one he had written himself. David didn't need to watch as Sarah's world crumbled. He didn't need to see her tears or hear her apologies. He knew it was over. The justice he had been seeking wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming his life, his power, and his dignity. Sarah had underestimated him, but David was never the man she thought he was. The next few days passed in a blur. David kept to himself, focusing on his work and his new venture. The media coverage of Sarah's scandal continued to grow, but David didn't care. What mattered now was the future he was building, a future where he was in control. And then came the phone call. It was from her, Sarah. David didn't answer immediately. He knew what she wanted: closure, a chance to explain herself, maybe even beg for forgiveness. But David didn't need to hear her side of the story. He had already heard it in her voice, in the way she had lied to him for years. There was nothing she could say that would change what had happened. He let the phone ring, and as it stopped, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had won. He had taken back what was his and more. The truth had come to light, and Sarah was left to pick up the pieces of a life she had destroyed. And as for David, he had found his strength again. He had built something new from the ashes of his past, something stronger and more solid than anything Sarah had ever understood. After weeks of careful preparation and calculated moves, David knew the time had come for the final confrontation. He had spent countless hours building his new company, Reeves Ethical Capital, and now it was thriving. He had managed to carve a path for himself that was free from the chaos and deceit that Sarah had surrounded him with for so many years. But even as he built something new, he knew he wasn't done yet. There was one last piece of the puzzle he had to complete: confronting Sarah face to face. One final time. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about bringing her down, at least, not in the way she might have imagined. David had already done that. No, this was about something deeper. It was about claiming his power back, about showing her that she couldn't erase him from her life so easily. The betrayal wasn't just hers to carry. It was his too, and he wasn't going to allow her to walk away unscathed. It was a cold evening. When David received the message, Sarah wanted to meet him. It was the first time she had reached out since the night he left. The words she used in her message were simple, but there was an edge to them. She wanted to talk about what happened, to get closure. David knew better than to expect an apology. She was never one to admit fault, but he agreed to meet her, knowing that this would be the moment he would finally set things right. The meeting was set at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. It was the kind of place Sarah used to love: soft lighting, vintage decor, and a warm, welcoming atmosphere. David had always enjoyed this cafe, though it now felt foreign, like it no longer belonged to the life they had once shared. He arrived early, as was his habit, and chose a secluded corner by the window. He watched the world outside as people walked past, their lives unaffected by the storm that had raged inside his own. When Sarah walked in, she looked different. She was dressed in a dark coat, her hair sleek and pulled back. There was no sign of the woman he had once known. She didn't smile when she saw him. Instead, she walked straight to the table, her expression unreadable. David stood as she approached, his face neutral, but his heart pounding in his chest. She sat down across from him, her eyes avoiding his. There was a brief silence before she spoke. "I know you've probably heard everything about me," she said, her voice quiet but tinged with something that resembled regret. "And I know you think I'm a monster." David didn't reply right away. He studied her face, searching for any hint of sincerity. But all he saw was a woman who had gotten used to manipulating the people around her. He wasn't about to fall for it again. "You're right," he said finally, his voice steady. "You are a monster, but not because of the money or the affair or even the lies. You're a monster because you think you can destroy people and walk away without consequences." She flinched at his words, but quickly regained her composure. "I didn't want any of this to happen. I never meant to hurt you." David shook his head, leaning forward. "That's the problem. Sarah, you never meant to hurt anyone. You only care about yourself. You always have." She sat back, her expression hardening. "I didn't come here for this, David. I came here to make amends, to find some kind of resolution. We can't keep doing this forever." David didn't feel any sense of satisfaction at her words. There was no apology, no genuine remorse, just the same cold indifference that had defined their marriage. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table to her. Her eyes flickered down to it before she hesitated, then picked it up. "What's this?" she asked, her voice cautious. David didn't answer. He simply watched as she opened the folder. Inside was the evidence he had gathered: the fraudulent transactions, the forged signatures, the affair. Everything was laid out in front of her. A concrete record of the lies she had told and the betrayal she had carried out. Sarah's face drained of color as she scanned the documents. Her hand trembled slightly as she turned the pages, but she didn't speak. "You're finished," David said quietly. "Your father's partner has already filed the lawsuit, and the IRS is investigating. Everything you've built is about to come crashing down. The money, the reputation, the control you thought you had, it's all gone. And you'll be the one to lose it all." She finally looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "You're lying," she whispered. "This isn't real." David stood up, his posture rigid, his voice unwavering. "It's real, Sarah. It's all real. And now, you'll have to deal with the consequences. Everything you took from me, I'm taking back. I'm not just taking your money. I'm taking your foundation. The life you thought you could build without me, it's over." For the first time, David saw something other than the calm exterior Sarah always wore. There was fear in her eyes, fear of losing everything she had built, of watching the empire she had created crumble before her. David didn't take any pleasure in it. He didn't need to watch her squirm or beg for forgiveness. He knew that what he had done was right. The truth had come to light, and now it was her turn to face the fallout. He turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Sarah sitting there, holding the evidence of her own downfall. As he stepped out into the night, a sense of finality settled over him. The storm that had torn his life apart was over, and for the first time in a long time, David felt free.
The days after the cafe meeting were some of the longest and quietest David had ever experienced. He didn't feel triumphant, didn't feel like he had won. He felt hollow, but in a way that allowed him to breathe easier. For the first time in years, he was no longer suffocating under the weight of Sarah's lies and manipulation. The storm of emotions that had once been his constant companion had finally quieted down, and in its place was a clear, sharp focus. He had spent too many years of his life building a dream with her only to watch it be shattered, turned into a tool for her self-interest. The phone calls he had made to the IRS, the lawyer, the business partners, had all set the wheels in motion. Now the pieces were falling into place. Sarah's empire, her inheritance, everything she had once believed she could control, was beginning to crumble. David had been careful, deliberate in how he handled each step. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about causing her pain, though. That was inevitable. It was about setting the record straight. And as the days passed and the whispers started circulating, David found himself becoming a symbol of quiet strength. A man who had taken everything Sarah had thrown at him and turned it into something far greater. But there was still one last piece to this puzzle. One final confrontation that had to happen before everything was sealed. One last meeting with someone who had been just as much a part of this twisted tale as Sarah had been. That person was her former business partner, a man named Charles Daniels, who had been complicit in much of the deceit. Charles had been the one who had helped Sarah cover up the fraudulent transactions, the illegal business dealings. He was the one who had kept the secrets buried, all while making money off of them. David wasn't looking for justice when it came to Charles. He wasn't seeking revenge, just wanted to make sure Charles knew that he had been outplayed. That the man who had thought himself untouchable was now nothing more than a pawn in David's game. It was another rainy evening when David met Charles at a bar in downtown Bennett. The atmosphere was dim, the kind of place where people could hide in the shadows if they needed to. David had never liked bars like this, but it was the perfect place for what he needed to do. He had called Charles under the guise of wanting to settle things business, of course. But David knew that this wasn't going to be a simple business meeting. This was going to be his final act in the symphony of retribution he had been orchestrating. When Charles walked in, David noticed the arrogance that still clung to him. The man was dressed in a tailored suit, as always, his hair perfectly combed. But his eyes weren't the same as they had once been. They were wide, nervous, like a man who knew his world was about to collapse. Charles sat down across from David, a drink already in his hand. "David," Charles said, a forced smile on his face, "I wasn't expecting to hear from you. What's this about?" David didn't smile back. He didn't offer pleasantries. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes locked on Charles with cold intensity. "I think you know exactly why I'm here," he said, his voice low. You've been playing a dangerous game for a long time, and it's over. Charles chuckled nervously, trying to brush off David's words. I don't know what you're talking about. I've been nothing but fair to you. This is all just business. David reached into his bag and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table toward Charles. It was the same folder he had shown Sarah weeks ago. The evidence, the proof that Charles had helped her cover up the fraud, the lies, the financial misdeeds. Charles' hands shook as he picked it up, his face draining of color as he looked through the documents. You think you're untouchable? David continued, his voice unwavering. But you're not. Everything you've done is in here. Every lie, every deal, every shady transaction. And I've made sure that everyone who needs to see it will see it. Charles set the folder down, his face now pale, his arrogance gone. Can't do this, he said, his voice trembling. This is going too far. David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You think you're the victim here? You and Sarah thought you could get away with it. Thought you could ruin me and walk away with everything. But you didn't count on me. You didn't count on me turning the tables on me, taking back everything you tried to take from me. Charles was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing, trying to come up with a way out. But David had already won. He had already dismantled everything. There was nothing left for Charles to do but accept his fate. I'm not going to fight you on this, Charles said finally, his voice resigned. You've already won. David didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The truth was clear. Charles had lost, just like Sarah had. And now, all that was left was for David to walk away from the wreckage they had caused. David stood up, slipping the folder back into his bag. Hey, I've already taken what I needed, he said, his voice steady. I'll keep whatever else is left. But know this. You'll never be the man you once were, and neither will Sarah. He turned and walked out of the bar, leaving Charles behind. As he stepped into the rain-soaked streets of Bennett, David didn't feel the satisfaction he might have expected. No, this was different. This was about closure, not victory. He had rebuilt his life from the ashes of his past, and now he was finally free.
The moment Charles opened the folder, the atmosphere shifted. He scanned through the documents, his expression tightening with every page he turned. The first page showed the forged signatures. The next page detailed misreported earnings. And the last page was a copy of the hotel receipts, the evidence he had tried so hard to conceal. David watched him closely, not a flicker of emotion on his face. It was as though he were watching a man who realized, far too late, that the walls had been closing in on him. Charles stopped flipping through the pages when he reached the final document, a legal letter from David's attorney, confirming that a lawsuit had already been filed. Charles slammed the folder shut, his face now red with frustration. This is insane, he spat, his voice trembling with the weight of the situation. You're really doing this. You're going to ruin everything. David remained calm, his gaze unwavering. It's already ruined. You just didn't realize it yet. Charles stood up suddenly, knocking the chair back in a flurry of motion. I'm not going down for this, he hissed. I'll fight you. I'll expose everything, your little plan. All your dirty work. David cut him off with a simple gesture, raising his hand in a calm, almost dismissive motion. It's over, Charles. You don't get to threaten me anymore. The game's done. For a moment, there was silence. Charles stood there, shaking with rage, his chest heaving as he glared at David. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Then, without another word, Charles snatched the folder from the table and stormed out of the bar. David sat there for a few moments, allowing the finality of the situation to wash over him. It was done. Sarah had been the catalyst, but Charles had been the final piece of the puzzle. The man who had hidden behind legal loopholes, who had tried to control the narrative and keep everything covered up. He was exposed now, just as Sarah had been. But as David watched Charles leave the bar, he didn't feel a sense of victory. He didn't feel like he had won. He just felt empty. In the end, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about destroying his enemies. It was about protecting what was his, about rebuilding his life from the ground up, and making sure that the people who had tried to take everything from him would be left to pick up the pieces of their own destruction. David didn't stay much longer in the bar. He paid for his drink and walked out into the rain. The streets of Bennett were quiet, and for the first time in a long time, David found that the silence didn't feel suffocating anymore. It felt peaceful. He had done what he needed to do. He had taken back control. But the hardest part was yet to come. The next morning, David woke early. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat down in front of his laptop, ready to take the next step. He had gathered all the evidence, made his moves, and ensured that the people who needed to know about Sarah's betrayal were now fully aware. But it wasn't enough to just make sure they knew. No, David had bigger plans. He had already begun working on his next big move. He opened the mail from his attorney, another document confirming the legal actions that were set into motion. David had already informed Thomas Moore, Sarah's father, about everything. The fraudulent documents, the stolen assets, and the illegal transfers that had been hidden from him. He had also ensured that the business partners Sarah had once used to further her lies were now working with him. They were all aligned now, all of them in David's corner. But there was still one more thing left to do. David had spent years building something with Sarah. Together, they had created a business, a design firm that had become successful in its own right. But now, all that had been taken from him, his designs, his work, his contribution. It had all been erased by Sarah's manipulation. It wasn't enough for him to simply walk away with the money, the assets, and the satisfaction of knowing that he had ruined her. No, David wanted something more. He wanted to ensure that Sarah would never have the chance to walk away unscathed. He wanted her to understand the true cost of her betrayal. He called his attorney again, confirming the details for the final confrontation. David's plan was to expose Sarah for everything she had done, to make sure that her name would forever be associated with the fraud and deceit she had orchestrated. He didn't want her to be able to run off into the sunset with her newfound fortune, untouched by the consequences of her actions. He wanted her to face the music, just as he had. David felt a rush of determination as he made the final preparations. He was ready for the next step. It was time to make Sarah see the true cost of her betrayal. And this time, it wouldn't just be about her reputation. It would be about everything she had taken from him. His dignity, his trust, his love. All of it, gone in the blink of an eye. David was done playing the victim. Now, he was the architect of her downfall. Charles's fingers trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. His eyes scanned the documents inside quickly, and for the first time, David noticed a flicker of unease in his usually confident demeanor. The paperwork inside wasn't just a mere formality. It was a full account of everything that had been uncovered: the forged documents, the illicit transactions, the damning evidence that Charles had helped Sarah hide. Charles's jaw tightened as he read through the pages, and David waited patiently, letting the silence fill the space between them. He watched as Charles's face changed from one of indifference to one of concern, and then, just for a moment, fear. "You think this changes anything?" Charles finally asked, his voice strained. "You think any of this is going to make me go down for what I did?" David leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "I don't need you to go down. You're already there. You just haven't realized it yet." Charles slammed the papers down on the table, his face flushed with anger. "You're playing a dangerous game, David. This isn't over. You'll regret this. Sarah might have had her plans, but you won't be able to escape the consequences of this." David didn't flinch. He'd already seen the consequences. It wasn't about exposing Charles to the world. It was about making sure that he never had the chance to walk away unscathed. There were no more threats to be made. Everything was already in motion. The business, the assets, and Sarah's carefully curated life had already started to unravel. And David was the one pulling the strings. Charles's eyes narrowed, a look of calculation crossing his face. "What do you want, David?" he asked, his tone suddenly shifting. "If you're going to destroy me, what do you expect to gain from this?" David sighed, leaning forward. "It's not about destroying you, Charles. It is about making sure that the people who tried to play games with me understand that I am not the one they should have been playing with." There was a long pause. Charles studied David for a moment, as if trying to gauge if there was any hesitation, any sign of weakness in him. But David remained steadfast, a man who had been through too much to be intimidated. "You don't get it, do you?" Charles muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah has already won. She has the money, the power. She's untouchable now." David shook his head slowly. "You're wrong. She's only as untouchable as you make her." And that's exactly why this is happening. She thought she had control. She thought she could buy her way out of this. But I'm not playing by her rules. I'm playing by my own. Charles's expression faltered for a moment, and for the first time, David could see the cracks in his armor. The man had been so sure of himself, so confident in his ability to manipulate the system. But now, David had the upper hand. Don't worry, Charles, David continued. This isn't just about Sarah. It's about everything she's been hiding, everything she's been willing to sacrifice. It is about making sure that the truth comes out and that she'll never have the luxury of living with the lies she has built around her. Charles opened his mouth as if to say something, but David stood up, cutting him off. This conversation is over. You'll see the rest of the details in court. But for now, you can take this and deal with it. David turned his back to Charles, knowing that the man had no more power over him. He didn't need to hear any more empty threats or protests. He had already won. Walking out of the restaurant, the cold air hit David's face, and he took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of freedom that washed over him. It wasn't the freedom he had wanted. He had once thought it would come with a sense of victory, of triumph over those who had wronged him. But now, it felt different. It felt like the first breath after a long, suffocating silence. As David walked down the street, the weight of everything that had happened began to settle in. It was all done now. The legal battle, the betrayal, the lies. It was all unfolding just as he had planned. But there was still more to be done. There was still the matter of Sarah. He had built everything with his own hands. The business, the house, the life they had shared. But Sarah had always kept control, always made sure she held the reins. Now, that control had slipped through her fingers, and David was ready to make sure it stayed that way. The next few weeks would be a flurry of legal motions, meetings with his attorney, and phone calls to make sure everything was lined up perfectly. But David was no longer the man who had walked into this mess with his heart on his sleeve. He was someone else now, someone stronger, someone who understood the cost of trust, and someone who knew exactly how to make people pay for their mistakes. And Sarah would learn that lesson soon enough. David sat at his desk in the small rented apartment, the soft hum of the city outside his window nothing more than background noise. The air was thick with the tension of the next steps. He had already set the wheels of destruction in motion. His fingers danced across the keyboard as he opened another email. This one was to a trusted associate in the legal world, a partner who had been more than just a business contact. They had shared moments of vulnerability, of professional success, and now David needed him to deliver the final blow. Make sure this gets to the right hands, David typed, his eyes focused on the screen. There's more at stake here than a simple divorce. I need you to tie every loose end. Let's make sure it's not just Sarah who pays the price for her betrayal, but everyone who helped her. He clicked send. The truth was, David had already taken steps to ensure Sarah's world crumbled. He had tracked her financials, sent in the IRS whistleblower report, and watched as the foundation she had worked so hard to build started to deteriorate. Her business, her trust funds, everything she had acquired through manipulation and deceit was slipping away, piece by piece. The last phase of his plan was about to unfold, and it would be devastating. David leaned back in his chair, staring out of the window at the city skyline. He had never imagined it would come to this. He had loved her. He had sacrificed everything for her. But now, all of that was gone. All that was left was the truth. And the truth was always the most dangerous weapon in any battle. His phone buzzed. It was an update from his lawyer about the next legal step he was going to take. His eyes scanned the message, and a small smile played at the corner of his lips. The pieces were falling into place faster than he had expected. It had taken patience, months of careful planning, research, and quiet action. But the payoff was worth it. The gain was no longer about saving his marriage or restoring a sense of normalcy. It was about ensuring Sarah and her family understood what real consequences felt like. It was about showing them that power could be gained and lost, but true strength came from the ability to weather storms and still stand tall. David had taken everything he needed, and now it was time for the final confrontation. The night had fallen over the city, and the streets below were bathed in a soft golden glow from the streetlights. David walked through the empty halls of the apartment building, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He had done what he needed to do. Every piece was in place, and now there was only one thing left to do: confront Sarah. He had no plans to make a scene. His goal wasn't to humiliate her, but to show her the truth of his actions. He wanted her to see what she had done, to face the consequences of her betrayal. The only way to do that was in person. David had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure. Now, that calmness would be his weapon. As he reached the restaurant, a small, intimate place she used to love, he saw her sitting at a corner table, waiting for him. She was wearing a sleek black dress, her makeup immaculate, her smile sharp but forced. She looked like the woman he once loved, but the longer he looked at her, the more he realized that she was a stranger. The woman sitting across from him wasn't his partner, his equal, his love. She was someone who had chosen power over everything else, and David wasn't going to let her get away with it. He sat down across from her, his gaze steady. She didn't look at him directly, but rather adjusted the wine glass in front of her, as if trying to avoid the inevitable confrontation. But David wouldn't let her. "Hi," he said, his voice calm. "I'm glad you could make it." She gave a small, tight smile, her lips almost trembling. "You look well," she said, her voice as icy as ever. "I assume you've been busy." David nodded. "I've been keeping myself occupied, yes, but it's not why I asked to meet tonight." He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table. "I wanted to talk about what has been happening, everything that has been going on behind my back." Her eyes flickered with annoyance, but she didn't speak. She was waiting for him to say something that would give her a chance to dismiss it, to move on with her life without confrontation. But David wasn't going to give her that luxury. "I know about the affair," he continued, his tone steady. "I know about the man you've been seeing. I know about everything you've done to cover it up. And I know about the money you've been hiding from me." He could see her stiffen, her fingers gripping the wine glass tightly. "You thought you could bury it all, didn't you? You thought you could get away with it." Her eyes widened for a brief moment before she caught herself, her features hardening. "This is ridiculous," she said, trying to push the conversation aside. "We're past all of this, David." "No," David said, his voice unwavering. "You don't get to walk away from this. You've taken everything from me. My dignity, my trust, the life we built. But I'm not going to let you walk away unscathed. Not this time." Her face twisted into a mask of cold arrogance. "What do you think you're going to do, David? I have everything. I have the money, the resources, the connections. You're nothing." David took a deep breath, his anger bubbling just below the surface. He knew this moment was coming. He had known for months now that she would try to downplay it, to make him feel small, weak. But he wasn't going to let her. "I don't need your money," he said, his voice low but firm. "I don't need your connections. What I need, Sarah, is for you to understand the consequences of your actions. You've betrayed me, and now you're going to pay for it." Her smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, lifting her chin in defiance. "I don't have time for this. I've moved on. You should too." David smiled, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was the smile of someone who had nothing left to lose. "You're right about one thing," he said. "You have moved on, but you haven't moved on from the consequences of your choices. And now, they're going to catch up to you." He slid a folder across the table toward her. "Here's the evidence. The lawsuit, the tax fraud, the embezzlement. The world you've built is about to collapse, and I'm just here to watch it happen." Sarah's eyes darted to the folder, her face draining of color. For the first time in their conversation, she looked shaken. The confidence she had once carried so effortlessly was now replaced by fear. Fear that the carefully crafted world she had built was about to crumble before her eyes. David stood up, his gaze never leaving hers. "I hope you enjoy the life you've chosen," he said quietly. "But just know this, it was never about revenge. It was about justice, and you're about to see exactly what that looks like." With that, he turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving her sitting there, alone. He could feel the weight of the years of pain, the years of sacrifice, lift off his shoulders with every step. The life he had lost wasn't his anymore, but he had found something far more important: peace. As David stepped out into the cool night air, he knew that this was just the beginning. The battle was over, and the real work had just begun. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally free. David stepped out of the restaurant into the cool night air. the city's lights shimmering in the distance. His heart was steady, but the weight of the evening was heavy in his chest. He didn't feel satisfaction. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. There was no joy in watching Sarah crumble, no pride in dismantling the life they had once built together. But there was a strange, quiet peace, a sense of control he hadn't felt in months. He had fought for what was right, not for revenge, but for justice. He had let go of the rage and the hurt that had consumed him for so long. In its place was something different, something calmer, resolve. David took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. The air tasted fresh, free of the toxins that had slowly seeped into his life over the past year. As he walked back to his car, his mind replayed the events of the evening. The confrontation had gone exactly as he had hoped. Sarah's facade had cracked, her confidence shattered in an instant. He had done his part. He had exposed the truth, stripped her of her power, and shown her that there were consequences for her actions. The fight was over, but it was far from finished. Now, David could finally move forward. Back at his apartment, he poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid glistening in the dim light. He took a sip and leaned back against the kitchen counter, letting the warmth of the drink settle in his chest. His phone buzzed on the counter, and he glanced down at the screen. It was a message from his lawyer. He unlocked the phone and opened the message, which simply read, "The lawsuit is filed. The wheels are in motion. This is just the beginning." David closed his eyes and took another sip, savoring the taste. It felt right. Everything was in motion now. He had made his move, and now it was time for Sarah to face the consequences of her actions. But as he stood there, leaning against the counter, he realized that the end of this chapter wasn't just about what had happened to Sarah. It was about him, about the man he had become, about the strength he had found in the darkest of times. David had learned something invaluable over the past few weeks. He had learned that losing everything didn't make you weak. It made you stronger. And in the end, the things he had lost, Sarah, the house, the life they had built together, didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that he had stayed true to himself. He had fought for his dignity, for the truth, and for his future. He placed the glass down on the counter and looked out the window. The city stretched out before him, alive with possibilities. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer the man he had been. He wasn't the victim of Sarah's betrayal. He was the architect of his own life, and the foundation he was building now was far stronger than the one he had left behind. The next few months would be challenging. There would be more battles to fight, more obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, David felt ready. He wasn't running from the past anymore. He was stepping forward, embracing the future with open arms. And as he stood there, staring out at the city, he knew that the storm had passed. It hadn't destroyed him. It had made him who he was meant to be. The days that followed the confrontation with Sarah were filled with a sense of urgency and purpose. The quiet apartment had become both a sanctuary and a prison for David. He had made the decision to let her go, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't yet fully reclaimed his life. In those first few weeks, he started to rebuild, step by step, but there was still the sting of betrayal that lingered like an open wound. His thoughts were consumed by Sarah's smug face, that cold expression she wore when she handed him the divorce papers. He knew he had to dig deeper, to get his revenge not only for himself, but for the man he had once been, the man who had given everything, only to be tossed aside like trash. David had spent hours going through their shared accounts, combing through financial records, looking for discrepancies, things Sarah might have missed. He had already gotten rid of most of the evidence, but there was one thing left: the house that Sarah had taken from him, the house he had built with his own hands, blood, sweat, and tears. It had been his dream, a place he had designed with love, and yet it was no longer his. But David wasn't the type to give up, not after everything he'd gone through. He wasn't about to let her get away with this. He still had one card left to play, one last move. The real game had started long before Sarah knew it. The house, the business, the personal betrayal, all of it was leading to this moment, and he had planned it perfectly. One evening, just a week before the final court hearing that would divide their assets, David walked into his office and called his old friend, Andrew. Andrew was a real estate lawyer, someone who had helped him before in the past, and David trusted him with his life. "I need your help with something," David said, his voice steady. "It's time to get everything back, Andrew. I need you to make sure Sarah doesn't walk away with everything she thinks she will." Andrew paused on the other end of the line. He knew the situation. "Are you sure you want to go through with this? It's a risky move." David leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the city lights outside his window. "I've been pushed to the edge. She's taken everything I cared about, and now it's time for her to face the consequences. I want her to lose everything." Andrew took a deep breath. "All right, let's do this." It was the day of the final hearing, and Sarah was confident. She had prepared herself for the moment, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, her smile exuding an air of superiority. She had expected to win everything, the house, the business, the fortune. But she had underestimated David. He hadn't said much over the last few weeks, not even during the phone calls or emails. His silence was what worried her the most. He had always been calm, but this time, it felt like he was waiting for something big. When the hearing began, Sarah and her lawyer were ready to present their case, confident that David wouldn't be able to fight back. But when David's lawyer opened his mouth, Sarah's confidence quickly began to fade. "Your Honor," Andrew began, his voice firm and unyielding, "we have gathered evidence that proves Sarah Reeves has been involved in fraudulent activities. We have proof of embezzlement, forged documents, and misappropriated funds. This is not just about a divorce. This is about criminal activity." The room went silent. Sarah's face drained of color, her breath catching in her throat. She had no idea how he had managed to gather such evidence. She tried to speak, but her lawyer held up a hand, urging her to stay quiet. Andrew continued, presenting the evidence piece by piece: screenshots, emails, bank records, and even the signed documents that Sarah had forged to cover up her lies. The truth was out, and there was nowhere to run. David sat silently in the back of the courtroom, watching as Sarah's world began to crumble. He had planned everything meticulously. He had been collecting data, building his case quietly, and now it was all falling into place. The judge looked over the evidence, his expression hardening. "Mrs. Reeves," the judge said, turning to Sarah, "it seems that you have been engaged in illegal activity. Not only are you facing a divorce, but you are now facing criminal charges. Your assets will be seized, and your business will be investigated. Your inheritance is now in jeopardy." Sarah's smug expression disappeared, replaced by sheer panic. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She had underestimated David, and now the consequences of her actions were staring her right in the face. The judge adjourned the hearing and ordered the assets to be frozen until the investigation was complete. Sarah was escorted out of the courtroom, her lawyer trying to comfort her, but it was too late. David had taken back everything she had stolen, and she had lost everything. Later that evening, David sat alone in his apartment, staring at the city skyline. His mind was racing, but he felt a strange sense of peace. The anger that had once consumed him was gone. He had gotten what he wanted, but it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming his life, about taking back what was his. The house, the business, the respect, it all meant nothing compared to what he had regained himself. His phone buzzed on the table, and he picked it up. It was a message from Andrew. "It's done. She'll be held accountable." David stared at the message for a moment, then set the phone down. He didn't need to respond. He had already won. The storm had passed, and he was standing tall in the aftermath. The next morning, David stood on the balcony of his new apartment, watching the sunrise. He thought about everything that had happened, about how far he had come. He had rebuilt himself from the ground up, and now the future was his to shape. He wasn't the man who had been pushed to the brink by betrayal. He wasn't the man who had stood in that courtroom, watching his world collapse. He was stronger now, more focused, more driven. And for the first time in a long time, David smiled, not because he had won, but because he had finally found peace. He had taken back his life, and nothing, not even Sarah, could take that away from him. The story had come full circle, and David was ready for the next chapter.